The Cawthon family originally was in England. The first gentleman we have a history of is Richard Cawthon, and in 1700 he lived in Sheffield, England. So when Richard decided as a young man that he would come to the New World, he, like so many, came to Virginia. And he lived in Virginia, and he started farming and running cattle. He had one son, William Dabney Cawthon, and he did the same thing, but he left Virginia and he moved to South Carolina. He gave cattle to the Revolutionary forces in those early days, as did his son, who was William Thomas Cawthon. And William Thomas moved from South Carolina to Georgia. And so then from there we actually get into the history of the family that I know more about. And the fourth generation now, and his name is William Thomas Cawthon Jr. He was born in Georgia, but he died in Walton County. He then is the first Walton Countyan of the Cawthons. Now, he settled in Children's Home, Paxton area on the border, and it was the border, and it was still just called kind of West Florida, not Northwest Florida, just West Florida. And he settled there, and he had cattle, and he had a farm, and he had 24 children. And of those 24 children, he had 4 wives. He was a brave man to take on all of that. But like so many farmers and adventuresome people in those days, they had to have big families. But I think he took it to the extreme with 4 wives and 24 children. He had many nicknames. He was a very colorful fellow. He was called an Indian fighter because along that border, the Uchi Native Americans, they had raids, and so the marauders would go back and forth, and they would have skirmishes. They would be taking cattle and, a lot of maybe product from the homes. And so William, he fought them, so he was called an Indian fighter. He was also called the Cattle King because William was the Cattle King of West Florida, was the term, because he ran thousands of herd of cattle. And from that, he housed them in stock pens in an area we now know as Dothan. Dothan didn't exist, of course, and all of that land was called Cawthon's cow pen. And so his cattle was there, and he would sell the cattle. He even had his own boat that he could ship the cattle. So he was called captain for his steamboat shipping of his cattle. He also was called a preacher and the father of universalism in the South, because when he built his big home, which he did for his large family, he would have travelers come through and stay with him, and there were many traveling preachers. Most of them seemed to be universalist at that time, and they converted him. So when they would leave, he would be the preacher for his family and anyone else who wanted to come. So he was called the father of universalism, and he was also called a preacher. When he was about 40 years old and he was running the cow pens, he married his second wife, which is the lineage I'm from. Her name was Elizabeth O'Neill. And together they had 6 of those 24 children. They ended up getting a divorce, which was unheard of way back then, because we're talking about 1826. But they got a divorce, and I'm sure it's because she realized he had another family somewhere else and things. But anyway, together they built a 2-story home up on the, maybe Paxton Children's Home area. They had outbuildings, they had stock pens. They were self-sufficient with their farming. They even had not only the corn and the vegetables, they also had sugarcane. And so they would ship that places. A stagecoach would come through every 2 to 3 weeks, and it would stop at the Cawthon property. The driver would overnight there, and he would leave the mail. So they became the post office as well. One of their buildings was a post office on their land that people could come and pick up their mail. The Universalist preachers left. He also preached, as I said, and then he opened a school. So the school was opened, and his older daughters, were the teachers. So he's quite a colorful, important man for the very beginning days in what we know as Walton County now. Other families came around the 1840s or 50s. So there are many settlers and pioneer families that were about, but as we're talking strictly about the Cawthons, an interesting side note to the Cawthon cowpen is that General Ashboth of the Union Army wanted to commandeer all of the cattle that were in the cowpen, and he did, but evidently William fought him on that and didn't want to lose all his cattle, so he was arrested and he was taken to Fort Barrancas and he was put in prison. Now, he had been feeding both sides of the army and selling them, I'm sure, the cattle, but he was later released from Fort Barrancas because he was 80 years old, so his advanced age. They decided to release him and allow him to come back home. He did, but in 4 years, when he was 84, he did die. And the strange fact of his death is he's not buried with other family members on their property. I don't know the reason why, but he was buried on Eglin Reservation near Basin Bayou. And when I was a very young girl, my dad took me there and showed me that this is the first Walton Countyan that was a Cawthon. And he showed me his grave, and it had a headstone. Of course, that's all it had. It didn't have anything else. But around it was a small fence, a wrought iron fence. And that was remaining there. Eglin Air Force knew it was there. They were fine with it. But over time, it has become overgrown. It'd probably be too difficult to even locate, because that was in 1870 that he died. Of those 6 children that he had, the one that we're concerned with as my lineage is of the 5th generation, Murray Andrew Allen Cawthon. Now, he married a lady named Mary Jane Williams from Henry County, or one of the counties in Alabama. They are the first ones to live in what was called Lake DeFuniak at that time. He built the first house, and it was built there to the west of Thriftway. And many people may remember it because it was a 2-story house, and I have a picture. And that's where he built his house, and that's where he raised his 10 children. But I remember seeing the episode that was done with Joel mentioning a spring. Well, that would have been similar to the area that they built their home, because it was on the north side of the old Spanish Trail. So he built that first house that was ever built inside Lake DeFuniak, and as I said, he had 10 children. Of those 10 children, 9 first children were boys. So he had all sons until the 10th child, and he finally got that daughter. So there was a big range of spans, considering there were 10 children. So they were born anywhere from 1858 to 1882. So from those 10 children, and they all lived here in DeFuniak, they are the ones that are pretty prominent in the town during the time. They had 24 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren from Murray Andrew Cawthon and his wife, Mary Jane Williams. Now, of those 10 children, one son, Alan, died as a child. I don't know, probably an illness. And then there were 4 sons that were the ranchers that took care of the ranches outside of town. But there was a son named William Lee, and he became a banker. He opened a bank here in town. Later it was called Cawthon State Bank. And then there was a gentleman named John Crenshaw Burris, and he opened the Mercantile, and it was called the Big Store. And so most people have heard of that or seen the pictures. Then there was one called Louis Franklin, and this is my great-grandfather. And he was a dentist, so he provided dental opportunities for people in the day, and he was called Frank or Dr. Frank. Everybody in town knew Dr. Frank. He was paid many times with turnips and vegetables and chickens, and his dental chair is in the local museum, and it's not something you would ever want to have dental work done in, but in those days that's what they had. And so that was my great-grandfather. Then there was a gentleman named Thomas Hope Wesley, and he is known locally as T. Hope, and many photographs, or most of the photographs of DeFuniak and surrounding area, even down to the beaches, were taken by T. Hope Cawthon, who was a commercial photographer. And then the little daughter that was born, who's the baby in the family, her name was Mary Lou. She was brought up to be a lady of culture, knowing all the right stuff. She participated in the Chautauqua choir. She ended up marrying a teacher that had moved to the area related to the choir conductor for Chautauqua. She went to the normal school, which both women and men went to. She also went to Palmer College that was here. Both of those schools were here. When the normal school closed, then they sent the women who wanted, they went to Florida State College for Women in Tallahassee, and the men were sent to University of Florida at the time. So once those schools closed, my grandfather, who would be this gentleman's son, he also went to Palmer, so Palmer was still in existence when he was there. Of the sixth generation then, which is my great-grandfather, Louis Franklin Cawthon, the dentist, he married a lady, and here's some where the two families come together and make an impact. He married a lady named Estella Plank, and she had moved here with her family, and her father's name was Levi William Plank, and he had a wife named Caroline, and she was a Mattoon. She came originally from Amherst, Massachusetts, and was related to the poet Emily Dickinson. But she met Levi, and they married and lived in Iowa. He was originally from Indiana, and they moved to Iowa. When Levi moved to DeFuniak, and his daughter Estella married Dr. Frank, then Levi was still living here. He was a real estate agent, or a real estate dealer. He had this phrase for his business: real estate dealer for railroad, grazing, and ranch land, as well as village and city property. So he dealt in property. And he is the gentleman who decided to give all the land for the Magnolia Cemetery that we have today. And it was his vision not to build toward the front of Highway 90, and that's still not been done until it was absolutely necessary. So he donated all of that land to help that people in this area have a place for burial. He also built a home in DeFuniak, and it was maybe one of the second homes, and he built it on the Circle Drive. But he decided he didn't like living on the lake because of the strong winds and the dangerous weather, which is strange. So he had his home moved back onto College Avenue. The home does not exist today. It was there through the 50s because Dr. Frank Cawthon and his wife Stella Plank moved there and lived there. And they lived there when they had their family. And then Dr. Frank continued to live there. And my dad and my mother lived in that home with him when they were first married. And I was born in that home. Well, I was born in Lakeside Hospital, but I was born when we lived in that home. So it was probably in the 60s that the house was eventually torn down. So that one does not exist. But the one I had mentioned to you earlier that Murray Cawthon had built the first one that was near Thriftway. A lawyer had bought that and had his office there for many years. But after he sold the building, that house is still in existence down on the beach. Somewhere near Eastern Lake, they have taken that house and I'm sure refurbished it and are using it on the beach. So that's still living, down there, that house.